Hello and welcome to the Raw Podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name's James Copley and I'm joined today by Joe Nicholson and Phil Smith. How are we both doing?
Doing well. Phil's
Yeah,
probably a bit tired.
Yeah, all good. Looking forward to the season starting now. We're in that little sort of midway point, aren't we, where the football's back, but it's not quite the season. I'm looking forward to it getting going.
Yeah, me too. Lots to discuss, namely pre-season. We'll get onto the transfer stuff a bit later. Joe and Phil, you've been up watching the games in the middle of the night. We'll start with the most recent, Phil, against New Mexico United. What were your main takeaways from the game?
Yeah, I thought it was probably more than anything a pretty useful fitness exercise. I think that you could see that the heat was incredibly intense, and obviously having previously in the previous preseason friendlies, we've seen sort of the team split over the two halves. This time Mowbray's flipped it, and we're going to see two teams playing 90 minutes, if that makes sense. So it was a huge challenge for the players because they trained on the morning, and then the heat was absolutely off the charts, really. And New Mexico changed their entire team at halftime, so they were playing against fresh legs, sort of both halves. And I thought you could see that. I thought they were actually, for large parts of the game, New Mexico were probably the better side, as much as anything because they're in their season and their match sharpness was there. So it looked a little bit at times like something were being overrun, I think, in midfield a little bit. But I think that was purely just a fatigue thing. And ultimately, what we did see was Sunderland's quality come to the fore with a few really good goals. People have seen Pierre Ekwa's goal, an unbelievable strike. But I thought the real standout for me was Alex Pritchard, who, given all the things I just talked about, the heat, was exceptional. His intensity, the way he linked up the play, he was the best player on the pitch by a mile. So it was a decent performance. I wouldn't put it any stronger than that, but I think my main caveat would be that was mainly because of the conditions. Also, a baseball ground they were playing in last night, and you could see the markings. I don't know my baseball terminology, but where the pitcher stands and where the batter stands, that meant the pitch wasn't sensational. I would say it was a bit bobbly. So it was a decent performance, but I think the main thing is just what we're seeing is these players are getting a serious challenge fitness wise, and hopefully, in a few weeks' time, we'll be talking about how sharp they look and how they're benefiting from that.
Joe, what have you made of Hemir? Obviously, he sort of contributed to a goal against San Antonio. It went down as an own goal, but his presence was there. He was in the right place. He scored again against New Mexico with a header. Scored against South Shields. Obviously, didn't play against Gateshead on the same day. But promising signs, you don't want to get too excited because he's a new signing through the door, a fairly young lad. But at the end of the day, it's better to score than not to score in pre-season.
Yeah, well, it certainly looks like he's going to start the season, doesn't it? Unless Sunderland do bring in another striker, with Ross Stewart still expected to miss the start of the season. But certainly from kind of the early signs, I think we've all kind of liked what we've seen about him. I think you've mentioned before on the podcast that although he's 6'4", he's not really a target man. He does like to drop deep. He does like to link up play. And for the first half that he played against San Antonio, I thought he did well. I thought he dropped deep and linked up the play quite well, showed his strength, showed his ability to also kind of run at the defence through the middle, and was able to kind of, whether he got a touch for that goal against San Antonio, it was quite hard to see if it actually came off him or if it came off the defender. I think it went down as an own goal, but he got into that position and showed his strength to get in front of the player. So I think you saw him as well at South Shields. I wasn't at that game, but the early signs from what I've seen of him and the clips that I've seen of him, good header the other night against New Mexico to get on the score sheet. He does offer that kind of physical presence up front, which I think we've seen in kind of the halves or the other games that he's not played. There's still a real lack of depth there. Pritchard's played as a false nine. Jewison Bennett's played through the middle as well. And it's certainly a position where, with Stewart still injured, Sunderland still need to strengthen, because if Hemir is not available or if he's given a rest, there is a lack of options for someone to play through the middle. And we've seen that, I think, in the friendly so far.
Yeah, we'll come on to the transfer stuff and a few developments over the past couple of days. Phil, opposite end of the pitch to Hemir, but what a story. Matthew Young, 16 years old, academy graduate. I gather he was a Sunderland fan as a youngster as well. Circumstance dictated that he was taken on the pre-season tour, and he started against New Mexico, pulled off a couple of good saves in the first half, and was probably unlucky to concede.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, I think he's been at the club since he was 7. If anyone out there wants to correct me on that, but he's certainly a local lad who's been at the club for a long time. And you're right that circumstances dictated him coming on this tour. Obviously, Alex Bass's departure, and then obviously Adam Richardson picking up a little injury as well. But I think it's probably important to say as well that, you know, he probably wouldn't have been far off anyway. We've obviously talked a bit about that Sunderland under-18 side last year that nearly won the league, beaten only just by a couple of points by Manchester City. And Young was at the heart of that team, really. And going back a little bit further, when the Sunderland won the under-15 Premier League Floodlit Cup a few years ago, and that was the team where Chris Rigg really kind of emerged as this hugely exciting talent. Young was very much part of that team. So this really exciting crop of young Sunderland players we're talking about being the kind of next generation. Young was part of that. And yeah, you can see straight away why he's a goalkeeper. He's well over 6 foot. He certainly doesn't look like a 16-year-old in his stature, which is obviously exciting because he will have a lot of physical development to do over the next few years. And yeah, he's another player who kind of shows how Sunderland have been able to turn the tide. He had opportunities to go to the Premier League. He had opportunities to go to big academies over the last couple of years. But he's in a position now where, well, I think there's 2 aspects to it. One, because of Sunderland's on the up and because of the pathway, players want to be part of it. And I think particularly as a goalkeeper, Mark Prudhoe has an outstanding record of developing goalkeepers right through the pyramid. So, yeah, really exciting. And as you say, he made it one. His first save was a good one, but one you would expect a goalkeeper to make. But he then made another 2 saves. One low was left and one high was right. It was seriously good stops. 1 or 2 nervy moments as well, as I think you would expect for a 16-year-old on debut. But yeah, he looks a real find. I think it's funny, isn't it? Because obviously, we know Jordan Pickford is this really expansive goalkeeper who does a huge amount of work with his feet. But Young to me looks like another one who his first performance is a solid goalkeeper, good shot stopper, comes off his line well, and will build on that distribution side of it, a bit like Anthony Patterson over the next few years. So I suspect we probably won't see him for a little while, because you would think that Patterson will play tomorrow, and you'd think there'd be a senior goalkeeper coming in the next couple of weeks. So it'll be a while before we see Young, I think. But he certainly showed that over the next 2 to 3 years, he's someone we're going to be hearing a lot more about, I think.
Yeah, Patterson, Richardson, Young, Metcalf, the goalkeeping situation at Sunderland throughout the ages seems quite positive at the moment. It was a shame that Toby Bell, the young goalkeeper, he's gone to Chelsea. You mentioned Mark Prudhoe there, Phil, and having spoken to people in and around the academy, it seems that he's a real unsung hero. He's been at the club a long time. He was a player as well, and you need figures like that at the club. And talk to me a bit about this group, Phil. How excited can we get about them? Because we've seen Rigg come through, and there's other lads as well, Young, Ogunsui, who played against South Shields, as well as half the team that came on. It's promising in 2 regards, as you mentioned. One, that they're getting game time, and 2, that they've remained at the club amidst interest from Leeds, Wolves, Newcastle United with Rigg. It's promising, isn't it?
It is, yeah, and I think you've always got to be careful, because generally speaking, if you look at even at the very, very top Premier League clubs, if you take any sort of talented team of young players, unfortunately the sheer mass of football is that a lot of them probably won't make it at the very top level. But I think what's nice is, you had a generation of huge Sunderland talent, Sam Greenwood, Barley Mumba, Joe Hugill, who scored his first Man United goal last week. Now, there were lots of different reasons why they left the club. There's no one sort of specific reason, but generally speaking, Sunderland lost a generation, really, because of where the club was at. Now, moving forward, I'm sure not all of these players will make it at Sunderland. Some of them will opt to move. Some of them won't develop quite as quickly as we hoped and expected. But I think, you have that encouragement that they will want to be around Sunderland because of the project. I think the perception of Sunderland has genuinely been transformed in the last 2 years in terms of somewhere for young players to play. So I think it is hugely exciting. And obviously, Joe can talk a little bit about Chris Rigg's performance the other night, but we're getting towards sort of those Barley Mumba areas where, if you remember that pre-season, when Sunderland were in League One, where he was performing at such a high level that we started off saying, crikey, this kid's talented. And by the end of pre-season, we were saying this guy could be in the team first day of the season. Now, obviously, for one reason or another, it didn't quite happen with Mumba over the longer period. But I think Rigg's kind of nudging towards that territory where we're saying, are we actually talking about him starting against Ipswich? At the moment, maybe not, but I don't think we're a million miles away from having that conversation, which is incredible, really.
Well, talk to us about Chris Rigg, Joe, because after the San Antonio game, Mowbray came out and said, look, he's knocking on the door with his performances. I think we caveat every conversation we have about Chris Rigg with he is only 16 and we have to go carefully, and you have to nurture him. Even in our narratives and our comments around him, you have to be careful because he is essentially a child, and although he's playing football with the men in a cutthroat world, you do have to be mindful and wary of that. But when he steps out onto the pitch, he looks a senior figure in the way he plays. That there is some elements of naivety, yes, but he looks the real deal to me. He looks exceptional.
Yeah, physically he doesn't look like a 16-year-old, does he? And you have to be if you're going to step up to senior football. Joe Bellingham's the same as well. You wouldn't have thought that he's 17 when he comes on and he plays senior football. And Chris Rigg certainly didn't look out of place when he played against San Antonio. He played 45 minutes. He played the first half and was probably one of the standout performers in that first half. Got his goal quite early and could have had more as well. There was probably 3 occasions where he broke into the box. One of them he forced a save from the goalkeeper. One of them he was just kind of crowded out from a few defenders. But interestingly, he played as kind of a number 10. In the previous kind of times I've seen him play for the under-21 side, he's played a little bit deeper. And probably when he's come on for the senior team in the FA Cup games, he's played maybe a little bit deeper. But he was in that kind of number 10 position. He was breaking into the box like he did to get his goal. And it was really promising as well. And the thing that kind of impressed me as well, he did an interview with the club afterwards, which was on their Twitter page. And listening to him speak, you wouldn't have thought this is a 16-year-old kid kind of going away with the senior side. He kind of spoke like he was a 25-year-old senior player. And he's clearly a confident kind of younger player. And he stepped up really well. He obviously came on against South Shields, didn't he, and scored that winner, then scored again against San Antonio. So he hasn't looked out of place with the senior squad, looks very comfortable in that environment. And the interesting thing is he can play kind of multiple positions. As we've seen, he's played as a number 10, he's played slightly deeper. And I think Sunderland have kind of not wanted, it's similar with Joe Bellingham, it's similar with Dan Neil even as well. They don't kind of want to just put them in one position and say that's their position and lock them in. That's the only place they're going to play. These kind of players have got attributes to play in different areas of the pitch, and that versatility could be very useful. But yeah, certainly very encouraging signs for Chris Rigg even. How often is he going to play in the first team? I'd guess he'd probably kind of mix between the first team and the 21s next season. The fact that you can now name 9 substitutes as well could probably help him. So he could probably be involved in some more match day squads. But yeah, certainly a very encouraging and positive thing for Sunderland to have.
I absolutely love that interview with Chris Rigg, Joe, that you mentioned. As you say, it was very measured, and had you closed your eyes, you wouldn't have perhaps realised that it was a 16-year-old kid. But there were sort of little elements of him being quite young in there. Just to read you one of his quotes, he said, "It's been really good. This pre-season has been my first one of hopefully many with this club. I think the travelling fans have been great. The lads have been great. The coaches have been great. And I can't wait for the season to kick off." He then added with a sort of half-wry little smile that he was absolutely buzzing, and you could tell that he was. Just lovely to see, Phil, really. And that acceptance of Rigg to the fans and the fans to Rigg as well, which we know was an important factor in his decision to stay at Sunderland. Just a nice, wholesome story at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's credit to the club that I think they have genuinely. It would have been quite easy, I think, maybe a year ago, even 6 to 8 months ago, quite defeatist about the chances of keeping Rigg, just because he was such a huge talent and there was so much significant interest in him. And I think even when he first sort of was used in the FA Cup, I think there was a little bit of sort of suspicion, wasn't there, in terms of, is this a bit of a gimmick? Is this, could this be a compensation thing down the line? But I think you have to give Sunderland a lot of credit that the development plan they've presented and the way they've made Rigg feel part of it, his foot is made him snub some serious offers and some serious opportunities. And the other thing to say as well is, for all Sunderland will give opportunities to young players, you have to earn it. And that's the thing about Rigg. And you speak to anyone, coaches, players, he does not fear anybody on the training pitch. Since the day he went up as a 15-year-old, he's been kicking people if they come near him, and he's been, taking chances on the ball. So it is exciting, but I think we also, as you have to factor in as well, as you'll see with every single young player whoever comes through, and we've seen it with Sunderland players, there will be dips. There'll be spells where he looks electric, and there'll be spells where he looks a bit tired, and where he looks like he's working things out. So it will definitely be an up and down journey. But it feels like we're now talking about, Joe mentioned there in terms of his development for the season, we will definitely see him in the under-21s at times. But I think we're definitely talking about Chris Rigg as first team squad player, and that I imagine he'll spend the vast majority of his training time with the first team. And the fact that he's on this tour in the first place kind of reflects that.
On that point, Phil, Joe mentioned about Chris Rigg being versatile in terms of his ability to play across sort of midfield positions and in attacking areas, namely as a 10. In terms of transfers, do you think Sunderland need to or are eyeing another number 10? You mentioned Pritchard had a good game. Roberts can play there, although he does prefer to play off the right, and Chris Rigg can play there too. How do you see that sort of position developing over the transfer window, and sort of what's going on really?
Yeah, I don't think it's a huge priority at the moment. I think it's a difficult one to talk about because there is the Ahmad factor.
The big question.
Into it. And I don't mean that with Ahmad necessarily personally, because I think Sunderland are quite pessimistic about the chances of getting Ahmad back. But what I mean is Ahmad was sort of a striker, sort of a right winger, sort of a number 10. And I think his absence still leaves a huge gap that needs to be addressed. But the question for Sunderland is how they go about doing that. Do they look for someone with that similar level of versatility? Do they look for another winger who can really push and challenge Patrick Roberts? I think that's going to be a really interesting question. I think in terms of that midfield, I think in terms of the further recruitment, I think a good part of it probably hangs on where they see things with Jay Matete. Because I think if you talk about that number 10, I think Pritchard's an excellent option, as I've said. I think he's very underrated on Weir's side. I think he's exceptional, and he's proven that time and time again. And I think you then have Bellingham, Ekwe, Neil can play a little bit further forward very comfortably if he needs to. Chris Rigg, as we're talking about. And obviously Jay Matete as well. Now, obviously, what we've seen in pre-season, we've seen Matete play a slightly deeper role, which I don't particularly think is his main strength. I think he's better when he's got freedom to sort of drive forward with the ball, when he's got the freedom to go and press the opposition as well. So if Matete is going to play that role, then as it stands, although you might say you've only got one natural number 10, you've actually got loads of sort of slightly more advanced midfielders, and they are players that someone will want to protect the pathway for. Abdullah Bar has probably played his best football as a number 10. Now, normally he's done that in a back three where someone have played 2 10s. But really what we've seen from Mowbray is he doesn't see him as a central midfielder. He sees him as someone who wants to play off the striker. So actually, in a strange kind of way, you're kind of stacked in that position. It just feels like you've only got one, what we would call a classic number 10 in Pritchard. Yeah. So I do think Sunderland will recruit another forward, is what I'm trying to get forward to, over and above the striker. But I'm not sure it'll necessarily be someone who you can put in a box as a number 10. I think it's likely to be, someone of the Ahmad profile, someone quite versatile. And I think we'll see. I think again we'll see Sunderland be very, very fluid this year. Tri Hume was popping into midfield last night. We've seen Niall Huggins do it. So I do think, Sunderland clearly the priority is a striker. I do think we'll probably see another forward come in. I think, but I'm not sure. I would imagine that would be someone with a bit of versatility.
I guess, Joe, the way Sunderland played last season without a striker really put the onus on Ahmad, and he quite clearly shone in that role. But now Sunderland do have a striker. There's a bit less pressure on that number 10 role to be, the most creative output in terms of goals and assists. Maybe even takes the pressure off Jack Clark a little bit as well on the left, but obviously you'd want those numbers to remain high. What I'm trying to get at is that perhaps having such a physical presence like Hemir, providing he stays fit and plays most of Sunderland's games, as well as hopefully somebody behind him, might change, as Phil has hinted at, Mowbray's setup going forward.
Yeah, obviously taking Ahmad out, it takes a lot of goals out of the team. Didn't he want to get 12 or 13? And then you could throw a couple of assists in there as well. Obviously with no Stewart as well to start the season, that's taking more goals out of the team. But Sunderland were about the fourth highest scorers, I think, in the Championship last season, something like that. So they did still manage to score a lot of goals despite the striker issues. I think striker is still one of the main priorities, just because of not being sure where Stewart is at the minute. When's he going to be back? What's the latest with the transfer reports have resurfaced over the last couple of days as well. So you can't really be relying on Stewart at the start of the season. So at the minute, it is just Hemir is the only recognised striker. So that's definitely, I think, a position where Sunderland need to be looking to strengthen next. Obviously, there's the goalkeeper area as well, bringing in a replacement for Alex Bass. But apart from that, I think the squad is pretty set. I think at centre-back, pretty strong there. They've got a lot of options at full-back. There's a lot of options, even though we don't quite know when Adjulisi is going to be back. But you've got Gooch and Hume on one side. You've got Sirkin and then probably Alisi on the other side. You've got Huggins has come back into the equation as well. At holding midfield, I think they've tried Matete, as Phil mentioned before, as a holding midfielder this summer. It looks like kind of Neil is the first choice there, and then they've kind of seen Matete as a backup, even if he may be better suited to playing further forward as maybe number 8. But I think in that position, Ekwa and maybe even Bellingham have overtaken him there. So that's probably why he's been tried out as more of a holding midfield. And then as a number 10, there is options there whether Bellingham plays there, Barr, Pritchard, Roberts could move inside. So then out wide, you've got people like Lahadji as well and Bennett. So the squad seems pretty well stocked, apart from maybe up front and in the goalkeeper department. So, and that's credit to, as we mentioned before, to the recruitment team, getting deals done early, bringing in players that have been able to step up from last season after maybe a year or 6 months to adapt. So I think Sunderland are in a pretty good place, but certainly replacing the goals that, as you mentioned before, Ahmad scored and assisted last season is going to be a big challenge.
Indeed. Phil, the player on the name of most Sunderland's fans' lips over the past couple of days was Matthias Friggen. There was reports suggesting that Sunderland had put in a £3.4 million bid. It looks like a side in Belgium have beaten Sunderland to the punch on that signing, with reports suggesting that he is set for a medical over there. So it's clear that Sunderland are active in the striker hunt and in the striker transfer market. However, we know they were active in January and they tried very hard for Nemeth. They didn't get that particular target. I guess the key difference this window will have to be actually closing one of these deals.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they've closed one, haven't they? To be fair in Hemir. Yeah, I think what we're seeing is it's obviously the situations are probably a little bit fluid in terms of Stewart. I think what seems pretty obvious is they do want to invest in another striker if they can, regardless of what happens with Stewart. I think when we spoke to Mowbray a week or so ago, he said that loans were definitely a possibility later in the window, but that primarily someone was still pushing to sign their own players to make permanent deals. I think, given what you've just outlined there, it doesn't take, a rocket scientist to work out that they are trying to sign another striker for a permanent deal. And then I suppose after that, it would then become dependent on what happened with Stewart. And maybe if you felt you need another striker at the end of the window, you could then dip into the loan market. But I think it's pretty obvious that they are pushing pretty hard to try and sign another striker on a permanent deal. And given that we know they operate, I would imagine it to be a young player and potentially someone who we hadn't heard of before. So I still think that's kind of the plan A, if you like. And I still think that's what they'll be working towards in the near future. But as Joe kind of alluded to, Stewart remains a bit of an enigma at the moment. And to be honest, as frustrating as it is, I don't think we'll get much clarity on that for a good while yet, because until he's fully fit, I don't think it works for anyone to be having serious discussions about his future. So I think that one's going to be a little bit of a waiting game, unfortunately. But I think that also puts the pressure on Sunderland, as you said, to bring another one in. Because I think Hemir is exciting in that he just keeps popping up in the 6-yard box. And we saw for large spells of last season that that's not a natural thing for footballers to do, And the amount of times you would look up and Sunderland would have no one in the box, no one in the 6-yard box. And even when he has quiet games, he doesn't be contributing much. He seems to get in that area. So that's really encouraging. But it's a huge ask for him to sort of lead the line for a championship campaign when we're talking about Sunderland being ambitious and trying to kick on from 6th with no Stewart, no Ahmad at the moment. It's a lot of a lot of work to pick up, and it certainly can't be down to Hemir on his own.
Yeah, I really do like Hemir. I think for like a 6'3" striker, he does seem to lose his man very often, which is quite
I mean,
impressive. Really, he sort of like goes
he's
straight
not
around the back, doesn't he?
he's not a target man in any way, shape, or form, is he?
Very intelligent
It's just
footballer.
not his game at all. And I think that's, if people haven't had a chance to see him yet and they're expecting sort of that all action type player, he's really not. He's first and foremost, he's very technical. He wants to play little 1-2s. He wants to play little give and goes. That's certainly his style in his game, I think. But as I say, there's a reason why he's got 2, maybe 3 goals, because he keeps popping up in the 6-yard box, and that, as I say, it seems simple, but it's just not natural for a lot of players. And in those players are hard to find where it does come naturally to them.
Yeah, and if he was able to add through experience and coaching that sort of batter and ram mentality, for want of a better phrase, and really develop that area of his game, we could have quite the player on our hands. Do you want to talk about outgoings? Patterson was loosely linked with an exit. Dan Ballard was linked with West Ham. Danny Bath's obviously still a big talking point. Jack Clark linked with a move away. Lyndon Gooch last week as well. There's one I'm missing. Let's have a think. Who am I missing? I'm missing somebody. Anyway, we'll continue. But Danny Bath was the big question, Joe, last week. But Blackburn Rovers seem to have hit a little bit of a sticky wicket at the moment.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting one. And as we mentioned before, Sunderland quite well stocked a centre-back now. And Mowbray admitted that as well the other week, bringing in Jensen Seelt, who we've still not seen. Still not sure about his injury. He is out in the States, but we've not seen him play in any of the friendlies. Maybe he'll play in the North Carolina game. And then Triantis has come in as well. Also then with Ballard and 09. So the Bart one's an interesting one. I don't think Sunderland will be in a rush to sell him. From what we've heard at the Blackburn end, there's certainly interest from Blackburn. They're looking for another experienced centre-half after letting Daniel Ayala go. But then we're hearing these reports that they're going to find it difficult to sign any players, even players for kind of low fees or free agents and stuff. So it's kind of a hard one to predict. I think Danny Bart had an excellent season last season, as he was voted the supporters player of the year and was a really key figure in the side, considering the season before when the team were in League One, he wasn't always a regular starter when Alex Neil first came in. The fact that he then came in and really showed what a kind of experienced, solid pro he was, and also a good leader on the pitch, was really a testament to him last season. So, as I said before, I don't think Sunderland are going to be in a rush to let him leave. But as you mentioned before in the podcast, if a player wants to go somewhere else and could potentially get a better, longer contract somewhere, I don't think Sunderland would stand in their way for someone to go and get maybe a better contract and have more game time at another club. So it is one to keep an eye on. But Danny Bart's been out in the States. Well, we know he's going to be professional. He's going to be that sort of player that will be business as normal for him. Played the second half in the San Antonio game, and I thought he looked, as he did last season, pretty solid. Was winning a lot of his headers in the air. Was playing in the middle of a back three. Was organising the back line. What you'd expect from Danny Bart. So it's one to keep an eye on. But yeah, the reports of Blackburn as well may also impact what they can kind of do in the transfer market.
Patrick Roberts was the other player I was thinking of that's been loosely linked with a move away. Phil, we've talked a lot about Jack Clark and that transfer saga, for want of a better phrase, on this podcast. That seems to have died down for the moment. It may well come back around. Patrick Roberts, though, integral to Sunderland's season and making the playoffs last campaign. A year left on his deal. We know Sunderland are likely trying to rectify that. But a player you'd really want Sunderland to keep hold of. Mowbray is a massive fan of him. He's dubbed him one of the best players in the league several times. That's an interesting transfer and contract question that perhaps goes under the radar slightly, with the main talking points usually Clark and Ross Stewart.
Yeah, I think it goes a little bit under the radar because I think, generally speaking, I think everybody wants Roberts to stay and continue at Sunderland. I think that's why maybe there hasn't been as much chat about that. As you mentioned, there has been a little bit, which is right because he's going into the last year of his deal and other clubs will be monitoring that situation. But I think for all the things you've outlined there, I think everyone knows Sunderland and Roberts are both onto a good thing, especially, as you say, with Mowbray at the helm. I have to say, generally on the outgoing front, things feel quite stable to me. That's my sense of it. I think all these things we're talking about, I don't think too many of the outgoings have developed to a particularly serious stage at this point. Clark's the only one really, and even to that front, the bids have been well short of what someone would deem acceptable. As is mentioned, the interest in Bart is very concrete, but at this stage, nothing's moved particularly close. Because of Sunderland's situation at the moment. Bart is still very much in contention for regular minutes. So that's not me saying there aren't going to be outgoings this summer, because I'm sure there will be one or two at some stage. But for all the talk, I think things feel quite stable and quite settled. And the fact that you've got this group, nobody's missed this US tour, kind of underlines that. I think that nobody was at a point going into this tour where you sort of ummed and ahed about whether they were going to go out. Everyone at the moment is pretty settled and pretty stable. So for me, I don't, at the moment, I'm not overly concerned about that. I think Sunderland are in a pretty good position on almost all of these players in terms of, I think they have a relative level of control. As you mentioned, Robert's contractual situation makes it slightly different, but I would be surprised if we didn't see some positive movement on that in the next few weeks, or next couple of months. So yeah, I think it's all these situations you have to watch because they can change so quickly, especially when we're talking about Premier League money in some circumstances. But I don't feel like it's a particularly anxious squad or an anxious club at the moment. I think, generally speaking, they're in a pretty good position, and I don't think anything has developed massively up until this point, albeit with the obvious caveat that there's still quite a while to go in the window.
Absolutely right, Phil and Joe. Thank you very much for joining me. You can find the Raw Podcast on all of your podcast platforms and now on the radio as well. A radio station called The Cat now taking the Raw Podcast, so tune in to that. You can also head over to the Sunderland Echo website for all of the latest transfer news, all the coverage of pre-season, including the last game in America and the games against Mallorca and Hartlepool United as we build up to the Ipswich game at the beginning of August to start the championship season off. Once again, thank you very much for listening to the Raw Podcast.